Good evening. It's great to see you here. It really is. Tonight is a very special evening, and delighted that you've all come out for Hisham Matar. It gives me great privilege, and it's a distinct honor to introduce him, not just for the prolific writer that he is, but because I also have the good fortune of calling Hisham a true friend. As E.B. White once said, it is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer. And Hisham is both of those things. The raw, unbridled, and powerful ideas and emotions that are put forth in Hisham's writings are similar to those one receives from him as a friend. I've been wanting Hisham to visit Amman and to address our august audience at the Columbia Global Center for a couple of years. And I'm just thrilled that my nagging at him has finally paid off. Hisham, I speak for all of us here when I say that we are indeed grateful that you are with us this evening. Hisham will be reading for us from his Pulitzer Prize winning The Return, Fathers, Sons, and the Land in Between, Hisham's book that chronicles his search for his father who was abducted by the Libyan government in 1990 and which tackles fear, loss, revolution, and everything in between. So Hisham will read selections from the book, and then we will engage in a conversation and then open it for a wider conversation with all of you. But before I cede the stage to Hisham, let me share with you a little bit about him and about The Return. Hisham was born in New York City in 1970, lived there for the first 3 years of his life before moving back with the family to Tripoli. In 1979, he, his elder brother Ziad, his father Jabala, and his mother Fawzia fled Libya and settled in Cairo. And I think it happened in a couple of stages. First, you left without your father to Nairobi, and then your father left a few months later. But they settled in Cairo, where Jabala continued to be an opposition leader from exile. Hisham enrolled in a boarding school in England in 1986 under a false identity, as had his brother before him, in order to escape the continued threats to the family by the Gaddafi regime. In 1990, while Hisham was studying in London, Jabala, his father, was abducted from his home in Cairo by the Egyptian police and handed over to the Libyan authorities. The family never saw him again, but they would intermittently receive letters and audio tapes smuggled to them from the notorious Abu Salim prison where they knew that he was. The family last heard from Jabala in October of 1995. Then, in July of 1996, 1,273 prisoners were massacred at Abu Salim. Until this day, the precise fate of Jabala Matar remains unknown. The Return, which won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize in Biography and the Penn Stein Book Award, among many others, and was one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 best books of the year, is the story of Jabala's disappearance and the quest for details about his fate. But the book is about much more. According to the Sunday Times, The Return is a masterful memoir, a searing meditation on loss, exile, grief, guilt, belonging, and above all, family. It is as well a study of the shaping and breaking of the bonds between fathers and sons. This is writing of the highest quality. I became familiar with Hisham's writings, as many of you did probably, through his first book, a novel, In the Country of Men, which was followed a few years later with his second novel, Anatomy of a Disappearance. The Return is Hisham's first nonfiction work. Hisham lives in London with his lovely wife, the photographer Diana Matar. They both spend every fall at Columbia University, where Hisham teaches in the Department of Comparative Literature, Asia and Middle East Cultures, and English at Barnard College. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you my friend Hisham Matar.
Hello. It's really lovely being here. I just feel very welcome and very much at home, and that's thanks largely to Safwan, but the whole team and friends and family, and it's just been absolutely delightful. So thank you so much for making me feel so welcome. It's really touched me deeply, and has given me such an immediate sort of access to and affection for your city. We were saying earlier how almost every encounter I've had in Amman, the question is asked, what are your first impressions of the city? Which I think is a question that says much more about the asker than it does, about anything else, because it's a lovely gesture of what I would associate with true confidence, no? When you ask somebody what is your impression about something as close to you as your city. What I thought I should do is something I don't normally do, which is I usually give a reading from one section of the book. But I thought today I'll do something slightly different. I'll give you a selection of different sections of the book, because I thought it feeds in well to conversations that I've had earlier today with lovely students at the King's Academy, and just before this with a round table with wonderful writers, and talking about writing and how a book starts, and what is the relationship between intention and creativity. To what extent are you in charge of what you're doing? Is the book, in other words, premeditated enterprise where you say, okay, I've made a decision, I'm going to write a book about X, Y, and Z, and then you start? Or does it happen in a different way, where you start with, in my case, very modest gestures, almost against my own intention? I have an image, I have a sentence, I have a certain refrain or a feeling sometimes. Anatomy of a Disappearance started with a feeling I had for the main character, Nouri al-Alfi. I didn't know how he looked like, I didn't know much about him, but I had a feeling for him. And it started out of that. With the return, Diana and I went to Libya for in my case, for the first time in 33 years. In her case, for the very first time. And an editor of a magazine in America, who, for a magazine that I've written for, and he, the editor, also has great appreciation for Diana's work, said, look, why don't you write something about going back? And Diana can take pictures, and we'd love to publish something like that. And I said, that's a thank you, but I can't promise that once I make the trip, I will have anything to say, or what it would be, or what shape it would be. So, knowing me very well, he said, that's fine, go. And if you feel like writing, write. If you don't. If you feel like writing something about it, write about it in any which way you'd like. Gave me complete freedom. And so we went to Libya. We spent a month in Libya. In that time, it was such an intense and at the same time very pleasurable trip. Libya is a very pleasurable country. The landscape is so beautiful. My family, my extended family, are incredibly pleasurable people to be with. So there was that sitting right next to lots of difficulties, right? And it was this oxymoronic situation of being both in pain and in pleasure at the same time. And I kept a diary, and in the diary I just noted down what happened, some of the things that happened. Of course, it's impossible to note down everything, but some of the things that happened at the day very quickly. And then when we returned back to our life, I must also tell you, as an aside, I traveled exactly how you're told not to travel, right? I traveled with my wife and my mother together. And but it was exactly delightful for that reason. You know, they're both really extraordinary women and lovely to be with. So when we got back to my life in London, something happened that has never happened to me before. I just stopped writing. I stopped writing. You know, writing is such a daily activity for me, and it just stopped. It was like a song that ended, you know. And I thought, well, maybe this is the end of my writing life, and I should find something else to do. Something else. And it was under that state when I went, and of course, in the background, there's this lovely editor who's calling and sending emails and saying, "Have you thought of anything? Are you going to write anything? Can we have it by tomorrow?" And in that state, I went to visit a friend who lives in the Piedmont, northern Italy, close to Turin, in the Asti region. And this friend of mine is got a lot of pleasure around him. He's somebody that, as we were saying earlier, somebody that knows how to find his pleasure. You know, he's a great cook, and he's got wonderful art, and he's a wonderful conversationalist, and I was somehow consoled by all of that, you know, by all that life. And I thought, I'll have a look at those diaries. And it's been 3 months since we've returned from Libya. I thought I'll have a look at them. And I thought, for some reason, I took them with me to this place. So I must have known that maybe there'll be a chance to look at them. And I thought I will try to read them as though they didn't belong to me, as if they belonged to some other person, and see what happens. And I read them and decided to pick the first couple of lines, which are just, I'll read them to you, they're very matter of fact. They're where I am and who I'm with, or the date. And I thought I'll take those 2 lines, and then let's see what the third line might be. So treat it as though it were a work of the imagination. And I want to just be specific about what I mean by a work of the imagination. I don't mean fiction or non-fiction. I mean a text where you have had enough distance from it, and you have enough depth of feeling towards it that you can somehow fill it with resonance, right? It's something like that, is what I mean. And at my friend's place, I wrote a couple of pages, and they're still the pages that are at the beginning of the book. So I'd like to read these to you. Early morning, March 2012. My mother, my wife Diana, and I were sitting in a row of seats that were bolted to the tiled floor of a lounge in Cairo International Airport. Flight 835 for Benghazi, a voice announced, was due to depart on time. Every now and then, my mother glanced anxiously at me. Diana, too, seemed concerned. She placed a hand on my arm and smiled. I should get up and walk around, I told myself. But my body remained rigid. I had never felt more capable of stillness. The terminal was nearly empty. There was only one man sitting opposite us. He was overweight, weary-looking, possibly in his mid-50s. There was something in the way he sat, the locked hands on the lap, the left tilt of the torso, that signaled resignation. Was he Egyptian or Libyan? Was he on a visit to the neighboring country or going home after the revolution? Had he been for or against Gaddafi? Perhaps he was one of those undecided ones who held their reservations close to their chest. The voice of the announcer returned. It was time to board. I found myself standing at the front of the queue, Diana beside me. She had, on more than one occasion, taken me to the town where she was born in Northern California. I know the plants and the color of the light and the distances where she grew up. Now I was, finally, taking her to my land. She had packed the Hasselblad and the Leica, her 2 favorite cameras, and 100 rolls of film. Diana works with great fidelity. Once she gets hold of a thread, she will follow it until the end. Knowing this excited and worried me. I'm reluctant to give Libya any more than it has already taken. Mother was pacing by the windows that looked onto the runway, speaking on her mobile phone. People, mostly men, began to fill the terminal. Diana and I were now standing at the head of a long line. It bent behind us like a river. I pretended I had forgotten something and pulled her to one side. Returning after all these years was a bad idea, I suddenly thought. My family had left in 1979, 33 years earlier. This was the chasm that divided the man from the 8-year-old boy I was then. The plane was going to cross that gulf. Surely such journeys were reckless. This one could rob me of a skill that I have worked hard to cultivate, how to live away from places and people I love. Joseph Brodsky was right. So were Nabokov and Conrad. They were artists who never returned. Each had tried in his own way to cure himself of his country. What you have left behind has dissolved. Return and you will face the absence or the defacement of what you treasured. But Dmitry Shostakovich and Boris Pasternak and Naguib Mahfouz were also right. Never leave the homeland. Leave and your connections to the source will be severed. You'll be like a dead trunk, hard and hollow. What do you do when you cannot leave and cannot return? So those were the first couple of pages. And at that point, bizarrely, you become a close reader of your work. You know, you're not only trying to assess whether it's any good, but you're also trying to figure out what it is, what it wants, what are its appetites, you know? I feel that a work, maybe very much like a child, arrives with their own intelligence, you know, with their own tastes, with the things that they like and the things that they don't like, with their own enthusiasms. And your job is to figure out what that is. And you can, like a very careful, generous parent, facilitate for their nature. Or you could stifle it, or you could ignore it. And so reading that, I thought, how interesting. Huh? This is a text that's is got a stuttering movement. No? You start at a place, and every step it takes forward, something is recalled. No? So you're in the airport, but okay, now you're wondering about whether to go or not to go. It's got a hesitancy about it, but it's within that hesitancy that it becomes very absorbent of time and situation and feelings and circumstances. The other clue was that it is a text that is interested in a kind of extreme honesty, where you open up totally the self to showing up your doubts, your indecisions, your uncertainties. It's also a text, just right from the start, that is invested in literature and in art, and right, and particularly with these writers that I'm mentioning, and so it's already sort of in the world of the mind in some way. So it felt, those 2 pages felt like an invitation, as if the book was saying, here's your invitation, you want it, come. This is what you need to do. You need to be very honest, very naked, and this is what you're going to have to, and you have to go very much towards the things that frighten you, and you have to be very patient with things that make you incredibly impatient, right? Accept or refuse. That's the invitation. So that's how it started. Then I'm going to read you another section that excuse me, that now the book starts to have different registers, right? And one of the registers is this thing that I hinted upon on the first couple of pages. It's a kind of sense of porousness, right? If you imagine prose as a surface, some prose is like metallic, and some prose is porous, and both have their pleasures and their facilities. And this one felt to me to be very porous. It can absorb a lot of registers, the journalistic register, the meditative one, the literary one, the political one, the familial, it had a lot of different registers. So this is what I mean a little bit by porousness. I'm just going to read these couple of pages. I wonder why I had worn a black suit, a suit I had bought a year before, when I was, for a fleeting moment, persuaded that there was something monastic and peaceful about a life spent in black suits. I had worn it only twice since buying it, and on both occasions felt uncomfortable with how badly the cut fitted me, and with the knowledge of the exorbitant amount I had spent on it. And now, for some reason, I was traveling home in this ill-fitting suit. I had got up very early that morning, had put on a white shirt and the black suit, and taken a few moments to choose a tie, knotted it around my neck, then took it off and hung it in the wardrobe, the same wardrobe that had been mine when I was a boy, because the room in Cairo where Diana and I slept the night before we flew to Libya, lying on our sides to fit on the narrow mattress, was my old room. I was now 15. I was now 41. I was now 8. At the airport, my mother was still by the windows, talking on the telephone to my brother, Ziad. This was the third time he had called that morning. The three of us, Ziad, mother, and I, had planned to return to Libya together, since, and this was not mentioned but understood, we could never go back together. Not completely, because father was no longer with us. Ziad had not been able to wait. He had gone to Libya 9 months earlier, in June 2011, when the war was still raging. I remember the day he telephoned to say that he was 200 kilometers from the Libyan border. Diana and I were in a remote part of southern France, where I was writing an introduction to Ivan Turgenev's On the Eve. Ziad's voice kept breaking up. I drove up the hill to try to get a better signal. In the past, whenever he considered returning, he would call me, and I managed to dissuade him. This time, he did not dial my number until he had driven for 6 hours, first north towards Alexandria, then west, following the coastal road to the Egyptian-Libyan border. He did not want to discuss it. He just wanted me to know. We were disconnected. Every time I tried, his line was engaged. Everyone, I imagined, relatives, friends, and even acquaintances, were calling to wish him well. I had spent that morning, while Ziad was bidding his wife and 4 children farewell, thinking about the actions of a fictitious man, Andrea Berzeniev, in On the Eve. There was a detail about him that I had overlooked on previous readings. Quote, a vague, unfathomable emotion lurked secretly in his heart. He was sad with a sadness that had nothing noble in it. The sadness did not prevent him, however, from setting to work on the history of the Hohenstaufen and beginning to read it at the very page at which he had left off the evening before. End of quote. Berseniev is a Russian student of philosophy who concerns himself on the eve of the Crimean War with a German monarchic dynasty from the High Middle Ages that is perhaps as absurd as a Libyan novelist during the bloody days of the 17th of February revolution, sitting in a small cabin in France, trying to write a couple of thousand words about a Russian novel published a century and a half before. In the few seconds we talked, I heard in Ziad's voice that resolute tone he uses when he's about to tell me something he thinks I may object to. It would have been pointless to warn him of the danger, to remind him of the promise we had made to return together. So when I got through to him again, I told him how wonderful it was that he was finally going home. He said he would call as soon as he was inside the country. Later that day, Diana took me to the Plage de Bois, a beach she had discovered along the coast on the way to the Cap Lardière. We climbed up into the rocky reserve. We entered the unexpected silence trees create by the sea, the changed light, the moistness in the air becoming slightly more material. The trail was often too narrow to allow us to walk side by side. It was comforting to walk behind her. There were tall pines and eucalypti. There were wild flowers and occasionally a butterfly. The path curved and descended. Sometimes we were right by the water, close enough to touch it, and at other moments we climbed so high we were looking down at the sea from a great height. We often stopped and glanced at the view. I had my mobile phone in the pocket of my swimming trunks. Excuse me. Since the revolution, I had had it near me at all times, on the kitchen worktop when I was cooking, on the tiled floor when I was taking a bath. We had walked out so far that there was no signal now. I suggested we turn back, but Diana wanted to keep going. We were more than halfway to the cove, she said. Anxiety is a shameful business. I followed her, but I was silent and impatient. When we arrived at the Plage du Bois, my telephone caught a signal. I had a voicemail from Mother. Ziad had arrived. He had a local SIM card. She read out the number. I did not have a pen. I listened to the message again and drew the digits in the sand with my foot, large enough for a small plane flying by to see them. Diana was looking up toward one end of the cove, where 3 seagulls floated in midair. They held their wings out, and every so often would bend them to drop a meter or two, as if pretending to fall, as if playing dead, then glide up and repeat the maneuver. The activity seemed to have no clear motive. Perhaps it was for the pleasure of it. Perhaps this was a spot they returned to, knowing how the arc of the cove traps the wind. Ziad answered after the first ring. He called me by my old nickname and then laughed. I laughed too. So just to say something about what I've read, it's part of what I meant by this sense of porousness is the layering of moments, no? The moment of us being in the airport and me recalling just earlier that morning putting on that suit, and then my brother speaking to my mother in the airport, and then the moment a few months before when I was in France and he was going to Libya, and within that moment an older text on the eve. So that's partly what I mean by sense of porousness in the text. This is an example of a slightly different register, a kind of meditative philosophical register, whereby the empty voids in the story I'm trying to tell, the things I don't know, I try to fill them with imagination, with vitality, with a sense of curiosity about the bigger themes, the themes that are not exclusive to myself or to this story. Not knowing when my father ceased to exist has further complicated the boundary between life and death. But this can only partly explain why, for the longest time, even before my father's disappearance, the commonplace occurrence of being able to point to a calendar and say, it was on that exact day that a particular person's life ended, has always seemed inaccurate. Perhaps we should be with the bereaved, cover our ears and insist, no, he is not dead. Perhaps that is not only a denial of terrible news, but also a momentary recognition of a truth, one that passes and is buried along with the deceased. Disbelief is the right instinct, for how can the dead really be dead? I think this because absence has never seemed empty or passive, but rather a busy place, vocal and insistent. As Aristotle writes, the theory that the void exists involves the existence of place. For one would define void as place bereft of body. He says nothing of time here, and time is surely part of it all, of how we try to accommodate the absence. Perhaps this is why in countless cultures people in mourning rock or sway from side to side, not only to recall infancy and the mother's heartbeat, but to keep time. Only time can hope to fill the void. The body of my father is gone, but his place is here and occupied by something that cannot just be called memory. It is alive and current. How could the complexities of being, the mechanics of our anatomy, the intelligence of our biology, and the endless firmament of our interiority, the thoughts and questions and yearnings and hopes and hunger and desire and the 1,001 contradictions that inhabit us at any given moment ever have an ending that could be marked by a date on a calendar? Hasn't it always seemed that way? Haven't I always detected the confusion of funerals, the uncertainty of cemeteries, the bewilderment of a headstone? Perhaps memorials and all the sacred and secular rituals of mourning across our human history are but failed gestures. The dead live with us. Grief is not a whodunit story or a puzzle to solve, but an active and vibrant enterprise. It is hard, honest work. It can break your back. It is part of our initiation into death, and I don't know why, I have no way of justifying it. It is a hopeful part at that. What is extraordinary is that given everything that has happened, the natural alignment of the heart remains towards the light. It is in that direction that there is the least resistance. I have never understood this, not intellectually anyway, but it is somehow in the body and the physical knowledge of the eternity of each moment and the expansive nature of time and space that declarative statements such as "he is dead" are not precise. My father is both dead and alive. I do not have a grammar for him. He is in the past, present, and future. Even if I had held his hand and felt it slacken as he exhaled his last breath, I would still, I believe, every time I refer to him, pause to search for the right tense. I suspect many men who have buried their fathers feel that the same way. I'm no different. I live, as we all live, in the aftermath. I think I'll stop here. Yes, thank you. Thanks.
I knew we did not discuss which sections of the book you were going to read. You did say that you're going to choose something from the chapter Maximilian. Hisham just read part of chapter 15, Maximilian, which is in reference to Edouard Manet's The Execution of Maximilian.
Yes.
We'll come back to the theme of the art and how it plays into your writings. But the first theme that I wanted to talk about was exactly from those 2 pages that you read. And that shouldn't be totally surprising, because when we first met, I shared with you that that was one of a couple of places in the book that I felt particularly moved by. I mean, the entire book is incredibly moving, but we'll get to that. We'll get to how I sought you out and how we met and the first conversation we had. But what was very compelling to me about the passage that you just read is you bring into focus the fact that there is perhaps a false discreteness that we assign to the event of death. that it is something where we can point to a calendar, as you just read, and we say the person died on that date. The fact that you have lived most of your life, really, not knowing whether your father was alive or dead, that you conclude that he is both dead and alive. And that then makes you question, the artificialness, if you will, that we seek through closure when a dear person dies. We bury them and we move on with our lives, looking back at that as a full stop, sort of, that ended a sentence, that ended a phase. It's far more painful, but I think perhaps far more liberating and perhaps happier in a way to live with that continuity of life into death. I guess what I'm trying to say is, in reading those pages, and I reread them a few times, I felt uplifted. I felt sort of not letting go of those dear to me in my life is actually something that made sense. How do you extrapolate, from this and from the experience with your father and the fact that he is both dead and alive, to think more broadly about life and death?
I mean, one of the things to say about it is that it is not what I have to say about it in the book, obviously, is not a thesis, right? It's not like, that's not how I see it. There are more questions. I am proposing possibilities of what it might be, because I myself don't know, and I find it bewildering, right? And I am by no means easy with it. It's every time I remember that there is an extraordinarily high probability, far higher than the other option, that I would have to continue till the end of time, not knowing specifically when and how and where my father died. I am every time I realize that, there's a question in my mind whether I'd be able to bear it, right? Even though I have been practicing for a long time to learn how to bear it. But at the same time, it has invested me into questions that I think affect us all, which is the kind of miracle of being a human being. It's and our connections to one another. I mean, I'm flabbergasted by being a human being. I somehow haven't gotten over it. I'm sort of. It's certainly the most interesting thing that has ever happened to me. And it fills me with endless enthusiasm and curiosity and vibrancy. To me, it's an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary thing to be a human being, because the moment you're a human being, you are implicated into a very dynamic, complex story, You are literally, not in an abstract sense, in a very direct sense, you are the brother and sister of some extraordinary people, right? Like Bach is my brother, literally. It's not an abstract idea. Shakespeare is my brother. But also Hitler is my brother. No? This is a very complex reality. We take it for granted because we spend all of our time being a human being, right? Or trying to be a human being, that we take this complexity for granted. But it's an amazing terrain for the mind and the heart, right? To be thrown into this space where the distances between you and the most extraordinary women and men that have ever lived, but also the most horrific savagery ever committed, the distances between us and those events is actually very, very slight. It's very slight, and it involves us, that story, in a very powerful way. So, but also the other thing that it does is that it makes it. First of all, it's the most painful thing that has ever happened to me. Nothing is more painful than being a human being. It's a very, very painful thing. But it's also the most delightful thing, right? It fills me with great pleasure, and I am both horrified and consoled, right? I'm both shamed and honored by it, I am, and so that's a very complex space. And then you add onto that the very powerful, intimate layer of very, very strong relationships. Your mother, your father. Those are just, sometimes I walk down the street and I think everybody came into the world this way. Given how complex it is to have a mother and a father, everybody in the world came this way. It's a very intense experience. And then siblings and so on, and society and family and so, So all of this is to say that as much as the uncertain fate of my father weighs upon me and torments me, it is also a cause for a vibrancy in one's curiosity, and to think about what does it mean actually when somebody we love very much and think about is no longer here. To what extent are they not here? To what extent are they here? Given this.
So that's what I'm trying to say. I think that there is a blessing of sorts in that. As painful as it is. So what you just said about being a human being, how thrilling and how horrific it is at the same time. The same can be said about that experience of not knowing. So the blessing in it, what I took away from that is, boy, as hard as it is, in a way he's fortunate in that the possibility, the hope that his father is alive. And even if his father is not alive, the fact that you bypassed sort of that discreteness of death is something that is quite profound and quite positive, potentially. But let's talk about your mother. You mentioned your mother, and one of the most vivid scenes, and I think I've shared with you that when I read the end of chapter 13, in which you talk about a lecture that you gave, I think it was at the library in Benghazi.
Yes.
And reading it, I remember I was on a flight and I did not break out in tears. I broke out into sobs. I was literally sobbing as I read it because I was so moved by it. Here I'm going to address the audience. Hisham was speaking in Benghazi during that 2012 trip back to Libya with his mother Fawzia and his wife Diana. And he gives a reading and a talk, right, at the library.
Yeah, I was implicated into it. I didn't want to do it.
Yes, you were implicated into it. It was an audience like this. And then after the talk, questions from the floor were opened up, and a man stands up and he says, I'm not here for you, and I'm not here for the great opposition warrior that your father was, Jabala. I'm here for your mother. I'm here for your mother because she housed my mother as she did the mothers of many prisoners who had demonstrated in the 1970s. And she and his mother would make food every week. They would cook and they would go to the prison and deliver it to the guards and ask that the food be delivered to him and his fellow inmates, knowing fully well that most of the food was not going to get to them.
Yes, and books and notebooks and pens and cigarettes.
All kinds of things.
Toothpaste.
All kinds of things. And you gave such power, you know, in that writing. And anyway, so his recounting of it just was very, very moving.
Yeah.
And then I had the great honor of meeting your mother, and we had lunch together, the three of us, a couple of months ago. And I felt that she jumped out of the pages of the return, that I had known her, I knew her from reading about it, and that she recounted for me in greater detail how your father had brought the mother of this prisoner to the house because she did not know anyone. She had come from Benghazi,
yes,
in Tripoli,
she had become known as one of the places that you could go and stay. Our house. If you are, I mean, this man's mother, he was her only child, and he was, you know, a freshman at university, and he was arrested and taken from Benghazi all the way to Tripoli, and that's a long distance. It's about 12 hours drive, you know. It's a, and so she was, poor thing, losing her mind, and she asked, does anybody know anyone in Tripoli where I could stay? Because I want to stay for a long period, and keep knocking on doors, asking about my son. And so they said, yes, there's this lady, she's known for, you know, putting up mothers of prisoners of conscience. So so she went there, and she lived in the house for a year, and apparently my mother did this with several other people. So I said to her after this event, I said, you've never told me this. She said, oh, it was another time, you know. So also the return, I think what was interesting about it is that it returns you to different facets.
Right.
Like all characters are, they have different facets, right? And even somebody you know as well as your mother, another facet of her was revealed to me there.
And one of the things I loved about that is because so much of your writing is about your father. And so many of the what's been written about the return and about you is about fathers and sons. Even the subtitle of the book is about fathers and sons and the land in between. So I'm curious about sort of, you know, how women fit into your life. And you've described your mother as being the truly radical force in my adolescence. So can you speak to that a little bit?
No, I mean, I think that's the paradox. Because of the fate of my father and his public role and his disappearance has made him dominant, paradoxically, right? In my life, through his absence. But, you know, I'm much more my mother's son, you know, I'm much more the son of the women in my family, you know. I'm shaped a lot by them, and so I think that's the other problem with Disappearance. Is that one of the problems it does is that it, or any act of oppression, in fact, you know, I think embedded in acts of tyranny is the desire to warp reality, no, to corrupt reality, and to make you preoccupied with a certain. You know, I've always asked this question in a pragmatic way, because the Gaddafi dictatorship particularly gave you a lot of reasons to look at it as an absurdist enterprise, right? So it's very easy to make the mistake to think that's actually not a very intelligent setup. That was actually an intention. They wanted you to think that because it was quite cunning and it's quite clever in the way that it managed things. And so, therefore, comes the question: why make a man disappear? It's much more effort. It's much easier to kill someone.
Right.
So, why make them disappear? Is a question that this kind of fate makes you contend with, because you're thinking, why is this the case? And I think one of the reasons is that it's actually very effective. It's far more horrific, the knowledge that your loved one is alive somewhere, someplace, unseen, unreachable, right? That their suffering could be immeasurable, and you don't know. It alters everything. It alters the way that you put on your clothes, you know, the way that you eat your meal. You know, it infiltrates the intimate moments of your life, and having pleasure becomes a kind of a resistance, to this fate. And the other thing that it does is that it keeps the people outside, the immediate family, a big part of their emotional, imaginative life is preoccupied. It keeps you hostage, So it's a very effective political tool. And one of the things that it has done is that it has made me a little bit, possibly certainly in certain times of my life, unhealthily focused on it.
Unhealthy focus on
my father's disappearance, because I had no. In a sense, I had no other option.
How did art? So you have a really unique, as far as I know, relationship with art, and how art has influenced, makes it into your writings. So you speak about your obsession with a painting, if I may use that word, so I don't take it literally, with a Velasquez painting, and then you become a student of Edouard Manet's The Execution of Maximilian, and for a period during the disappearance, while you're in London, you leave your apartment only to go to your lectures at the university and to the National Gallery to stare at the Manet day in and day out. And then after you return from Libya in 2012, you moved to a Titian in Rome, the execution, not the execution, sorry, the martyrdom of Saint Lawrence. Talk to us a little bit about this relationship, how it evolved. How is it different from or similar to, say, reading a book or listening to a piece of music? How is that study of a painting different, and why does it take such a powerful dimension in your thinking and in your writing?
No, I mean, how it is that the most, the things that you are born into seem to me like the most normal things. And then you realize that you're actually very peculiar. Like, I remember my father and I exchanged letters. We lived under the same roof, but we wrote letters to each other. And I thought everybody else did that, Then I discovered it was a very strange thing to do, because we could sit and talk to each other.
Do you now know that it was strange?
I do, but I also know why we did it. Because I think we enjoyed each other's minds, And my father had in an unspoken way, he never said it. He didn't need to. But in the way he behaved, he gave me a really precious gift. He made me believe that I had an interesting mind, and it allowed me a kind of permission to be playful with my mind. And so we wrote letters, because there are certain things that you can say in letters that are, it's not that you cannot say them in person, but you don't have, lovely thing about a letter is that it's a space for your conscience, to communicate it. Much better than email in this respect. You can't quite do that with email, because it's something about the time.
Sure.
Even the knowledge that that it's not going to reach them this minute. It might take a couple of days or so. And so we did that. And but paintings. So I've always had a real interest in paintings and in architecture and music. Those were the three powerful forces. And I wanted for a long time to be a musician. I thought I really wanted to be a conductor. I still think it's probably the best job on the planet to be a conductor, because you're involved in interpretation all the time, and to be living with music all the time. Music that occupies a different space from all the arts. It is capable of moments where it's not translating, Every other medium is translating something, translating a moment, a feeling, a narrative, a story. Music does that too, but there are moments in music where it's not doing that at all. It is the thing itself, and so I really do think it is a very, very high art, a very wonderful space to be in, and it's lovely to enjoy it. But I wasn't very talented as a musician. I spent a long time practicing. It's complete rubbish, not very good at all. I'm a good listener. I'm a good listener, but I'm a very bad. So that was very clear early on. So what else do you do then? If music and architecture, literature to me, I didn't know that you could do it for a living. Because I grew up in a time that is not so different from the present moment, but more so, in the sense that there weren't a lot of people around me that were writers. In the Middle East, it was very difficult, continues to be very difficult to live as a writer.
Continues to be the case.
Right?
Unless
you're a journalist or so
by
on.
those young, inspiring
writers.
Yeah,
we met with earlier. So that, it's a very difficult profession. And on top of it, there's a cultural... writers in the Middle East, it's a bit like Latin America. Latin America is a very interesting place for us because there's a lot of parallels. And Latin American writers before the so-called boom generation, Garcia Marquez and Carlos Fuentes and Mario Vargas Llosa and all these people, that before those guys, writers there were treated as dilettantes, a bit like now in our part of the world. You're treated as a dilettante. I mean, you're a serious writer if you're a journalist, if you write for the paper. But novels, really. So there's that aspect that permeated the atmosphere around me when I was growing up. I could feel it, And there were lots of writers around me, but they all had other jobs. My uncle was a poet, but he was a diplomat. So and so was, my father wrote, but so I grew up with the impression, the erroneous impression, the wrong impression that writing is not a particularly respectable vocation and something you should do in your spare time. And so I thought, well, given that, I'll become an architect. Because I could draw and I had a thing for buildings.
And that's what you studied.
I studied, and it was an excellent education for a writer, actually. Really good education, architecture. Because it invests you into the history of ideas. To study architecture, you have to know history of art, history of architecture. But it also space, but it's also it teaches you to look. I remember the first class, I arrived, and I'm sure particularly the young members of the audience would know this very well. The first time you enroll into a new school or university, you really have no clue what's going on. You arrive with your anxieties and bewilderments and maybe excitements if you're lucky and going to a place you like. And you're kind of second guessing all the time. And I was very much like that. And they said, there's a table with pencils and big sheets of paper. And the only thing the professor said, don't take one piece, take two pieces. You probably need to take two pieces of paper. And take a pencil and go outside. You see in the green there, you see that. Choose a tree and draw it. And you don't have a lot of time. You only have 3 hours. 3 hours. Now, I hadn't looked at anything for 3 hours up to that point. And I learned that when I sat down for 3 hours trying to draw the tree changed. I realized that I had never really looked at a tree. Had you asked me at that point, do you know trees? I'd say, yeah, I do, of course. They have trunks, they go down, they go up. I know what a tree is. But that experience taught me that there's looking and looking. They're two separate ones. They're not the same. And really attending to it, you see it in a different way. And and it seemed like the more I looked at it, the more I found into it. And that, I think, combined, that knowledge combined with my own dislike of museums, and I think museums are dreadful places, actually. They're sort of, I don't like the air, I feel hampered by them. But I love art, so I keep going to these places that I find difficult to be in. So I resolved that what I will do is, because I don't understand how you do that when you go to a museum. and you go from one picture to the other. You stand maybe for 40 seconds in front of each one. An hour later, you sit with your friends, you have a cup of tea, and you say, yeah, I've seen the exhibit. What's your opinion? It's like you've seen it, right? That's all it takes to see it.
Wonderfully curated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I just thought that doesn't quite work for me. So I still, of course, it's unavoidable that we have to do it sometimes. I do it also. But I wanted a deeper engagement with a painting. And so I would choose a painting. And somehow this allergy, or what was before...
the painting chooses you.
Yeah, I mean, before it was a kind of lack of enthusiasm for museums, but a real fondness for art. And then when my father disappeared, the fondness for art became more of a need, you know? And my lack of enthusiasm for museums became really bothersome. I would find it difficult to breathe. Felt very kind of anxious in them. And so I thought, well, how do I negotiate these two extreme positions? And so I thought I'll choose a painting. So it was meant as a temporary solution to a problem. I'll choose a painting. I'll go to it every lunch hour. So I was at university and had all the time in the world. And museums are free. In fact, actually, I tell you, it's as I know this. I'm absolutely certain about this fact, that if it weren't for free entry museums and free libraries, my entire life would be different. My whole education would be different. That's why I feel so passionate about free libraries, and public access to museums. It's very important. And as a poor university student in London, if the entry to the museum was for £1, I wouldn't have paid it. I would have maybe paid it once a month, right? Because £1 was a lot of money to me. And so the fact that it was free and the fact that it was kind of warm, meant that I could go every lunch hour. I'll take my sandwich and go and choose one painting and stand in front of it for 15, 20 minutes, not more, then leave. And that was a good solution because I got my fix, but I didn't have to be in the museum for too long. And I thought this would be a temporary problem. After a while, I'll grow out of it. I'll become one of those sensible people who go to exhibitions and go all the way around. But what happened is that it became a lifelong habit and vigil. So now, of course, I don't go every day, but I go 2-3 times a week. And I don't stand for 20 minutes. Sometimes I stand for half an hour. And it doesn't take me a week now. But then it used to be every week I would switch a painting, every 2 weeks switch. Now it takes me months, sometimes years. And what happens is that the painting becomes denser. And it's also like a really lovely companion. It's like a conversation. Some people go to an analyst, I go to a painting. That it's a really good conversation because, and it's a conversation with a very high intelligence, a very vibrant, alive intelligence, and it curates your enthusiasms. So a painting influences my reading, and it influences some of the things I'm thinking about, and then when I exhaust my interest in it, I move to the next one. So I still do that. That's a big part of my life. And your question about how different is that from music or from literature is that I think paintings are messing with you.
They're messing with you.
They're messing with you because they love the contradiction between the explicit, because they're explicit. They're all there. There's, it's inside a frame. It's all revealed. So therefore, it's deceptive because you think, oh yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
But have you?
Yeah. But then you realize that, and I'm talking also about great paintings. You realize that there is such depth and something deeply hopeful, not only about paintings, but I think about art in general, because art believes that there is a universalist correspondence between us. That you and I have much more in common than not. And therefore, the things that preoccupy me, that I write about or that I paint about, there's a good chance that they might mean something to you and something very private to you. And I think that's a very hopeful position, which is why, even a tragic painting can cheer you up, because you
Right.
think, so yeah, that's what I.
Yeah, it
that's what
speaks
do.
to you.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
and that's the sign of a great art. I mean, you were telling me earlier today how a teacher who used your book in her class in Tuscany wrote you an email and shared with you the experience of teaching it and her students' reactions and how they. And then she ended the email by saying, "Please give my best regards to Fawzia and to Ziad and to Diana," as if she knew them all and you had never met her. She had never met you. But I think that that's the power of great art that speaks to you and connects with you. And certainly how I felt, and I felt like I knew you before we actually met and I sought you out. Let me turn to another theme and then we'll open it up for discussion. Hisham was the Edward Said Memorial Lecturer this past fall at Columbia. Since the passing of Edward Said in 2003, we've had almost every year an annual lecture, and we've had some great people come and speak. And this, I think, was by far, and I've said this publicly and I've said it privately to you, perhaps the most beautiful lecture. And you chose to talk about being a guest and Joseph Conrad having been a guest and Edward Said having been a guest in terms of their adopted homes, if you will, and their adopted languages. And I'm going to quote you. You said then, Conrad had offered Said a secret agent or a secret sharer with whom he could have the sort of conversation that he could have with no one else. The biographies of the two men shared several characteristics: occupied homeland, exile from the mother tongue, exceptional success in their adopted countries that nonetheless did not altogether protect or cure them from estrangement and dislocation. They also shared something much more private: mischievous trajectories that are too complicated to account for quickly to a new acquaintance. Lives that make it difficult to be brief about oneself, and therefore it is forever tempting to altogether avoid the subject. You also said both Conrad and Said found an unlikely stimulus in the places where they had settled and which were in different ways indifferent or hostile to them. Introducing you for the lecture at the time, I drew my own parallels between Edward and yourself. You're both bound by immense intellectual prowess and literary scholarship. Your works are enduring documentations of cultural, social, and political phenomena of your times, in diction that appeals to the scholar and the layman alike. You're also a guest, aren't you? Writing in a language you learned at 12 and from a country that became home shortly thereafter. Do you see yourself as a guest? How does your guest status, if you do see that, inform your own work? And perhaps expand a little bit on what you meant by the hostility, the indifference or hostility that I think you meant when you talked about Joseph Conrad and Edward Said, but Joseph Conrad in particular and Virginia Woolf's obituary.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to use the honor and invitation to give the Edward Said lecture as an excuse to reread Joseph Conrad, because he's an immensely important writer to me. And but I also wanted to use it as an excuse to reread the works by Edward Said that I had read and read the things that I hadn't read by him, and spend a year thinking about them both. And in a sense, use their work to think about my own place in the world, in England, and I don't know if I've come to any specific conclusions. I don't know if I am a guest. I think I am, but I'm a little bit suspicious of my own guestness, of my own desire to maintain my guestness. I also allude to this in the essay, like Joseph Conrad, like Edward Said, have conspired towards my guestness as well. So it's not just the place. It's also, there's something about me that is determined to remain a guest. And I am interested in that and slightly suspicious of it. And I wanted to sort of open that up in the essay, to think about it out loud and think about it with in the company of these great works. So I'm not certain about that position. I have a very strong affinity for England. I feel very connected to it. And my connections are layered. They're to do with the literature, with the landscape, with which I write about here too, the landscape, and also with friends.
Right.
And yet I also suspect that part of my enthusiasm for it is its adamance to keep me on the fringes.
You want to stay on the fringes, don't you?
I don't know. This is why I'm suspicious of it. I'm suspicious of this habit of mine. It's I am suspicious of it.
Do you worry that if you feel too settled, that sort of takes away from your ability to have perspective, that being a guest or perhaps even a nomad to some extent helps? I mean, I know you and I talk a lot about your life in London and your life in New York in the fall and how to make them. And, I deal with this, my life in New York, my life in Amman. Is there something to that feeling of being unsettled that actually contributes to your creativity, contributes to your expansiveness in terms of looking at the world? Maybe.
I just know it's not easy,
Right.
I mean, it's also, I'm not sure how useful it is. I'm really genuinely not resolved in that. I don't know if it's good or bad. But what I do know, actually, is I yearn for a deeper engagement. Right. So it must be getting to me on some level. But yeah, it's and also I think I'm discovering the pleasure of the specific, of being in the specific. I think the trouble with yearning is that it could really cheat you out of the specific, out of the present. So I think that's something that I keep thinking about these days.
Right. And these things can happen sort of, they intersect in a way, and one doesn't come at.
But I mean that goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier. Is that in a sense, I'm not so preoccupied with resolution.
Right.
I don't necessarily feel that the most important thing about the world is to feel good, and we live in a time where there's an assumption made that if you can only cure yourself of the things that are bothering you, everything will be fine, and I think actually I'm quite interested in the contradictions. I'm also quite interested in things that, I'm interested in boredom, for example. I think boredom is a very interesting creative space, right? And I think our culture has kind of come to this, has come to a conclusion that the thing that you really must do is cure yourself of boredom or frustration. And I'm interested in those, I think. So this kind of habit of sustaining a troublesome coexistence of things is something that I'm most of the times okay with.
You're comfortable in the unsettled, in a way.
Yeah. I don't know about comfortable, but
you prefer it.
I find it more interesting. So far I have. I think something is changing, and that essay was a kind of turning
Right.
of that a bit.
Right.
I think now I'm starting to think about what would the facilities be in something that is a little bit less contingent, you know. Yeah.
Let's open it up. See the hand over there, and then we go here and then here.
Hi, Hisham.
Hello.
I made sure that I am the first one to talk. Hanal Galal from Libya. It was so heavy coming here, Hisham, because for me it's still hard to deal with what happened in the revolution. So listening to you is so painful. I was part of the Libyan revolution. I was leading figure for a while, first 3-4 months. And I didn't read your second book. I still find it so hard. Even listening to you now, I find it so hard. And this is where how I know the pain you wrote your first book, and I'm sure there was so much pain when you were writing the second book. For me, it was like 2011 was like a rebirth, and then I saw the dream dying in front of me. Reading about it or writing about it is so difficult, and I'm already moved now. So your courage is amazing. And I'm really appreciating and proud of you that you documented so many important issues in a very international language, so the story reaches to the outside world. And this is why I'm here, just to say how proud I am.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It means a lot to me that. Thanks.
What happened to Diana's photos from your trip? Where are they? They're not in the book.
Notwithstanding the slight accusatory tone of your question, I am thrilled that you asked it. The photograph. So the magazine I was talking about is that I wrote. So the first 10,000 words or so of the book were published in the New Yorker magazine with Diana's photographs. But even better, Diana has a book called Evidence that is a photographic monograph that is of a project that she's worked on over a long period of time that involved photos that she took in Libya but also in other places. And the book is about to what extent a photograph can capture the resonance of an event that has happened before. So she went to places in Libya where political prisoners were tortured and killed. She went to specific places in Rome where Libyan dissidents were shot. And she would photograph in detail in that street. They're very evocative, very powerful pictures. And together with entries from her diary, and a kind of strange and very powerful text that she wrote about my father, so like a letter to him, as it were, conversation directly with him. Up to then, I assumed that you can't have a relationship with somebody you've never met, because she never met him. But it turns out all these years with our life and my family and so on, she had a direct connection to him in some way. So that is the book that. And this is why I was saying a lot of the difficult things that I don't know how to say this in a way that is. I fear to be disrespectful, but oftentimes I feel a well of concern and good human feeling, as I do in this room right now, right, about my father, and I oftentimes feel like I want to say this, but I worry that it might sound the wrong way. I often feel that this fate of mine is really not is not in need, or is not the correct subject of pity, right? because, and I don't take your feeling as pity, I take your feeling as genuine human solidarity and depth of feeling. But it makes me want to tell you all the wonderful things, right, that we have, right? That the bizarre thing about my father is that all of the horrible things that have happened and the uncertainty and the pain, and that on some level it is actually very easy being his son. You know, it's incredibly convenient being my father's son. Given the accident of birth that you don't choose who your father is, to end up with a father like that is like fantastic. You know, he's lovely and he's honorable, and it's like in a time and in a place where it was very difficult to be honorable. A lot of good people ended up doing things that were dishonorable. And so it's very convenient. It's very easy. That part of it is very easy. And what it does is it invests me into the complexities that we were talking about before. It makes me have a strange, tender sympathy for the son of the man who tortured my father, for example. I think that's much more complicated. I feel for him, you know, and I think that is very difficult to live with that, you know. So I just wanted to say that, just to mention the blessings as well. But thank you for asking that question about Diana.
Diana, thanks you too. Yeah, I think here, and then there, and then Mahmoud.
Thank you very much, Hisham, for sharing your experience or your life with us. I do share the same experience, having lost a brother in the same way. I mean, he disappeared, and this idea of not knowing if he's alive or not. What I wanted to share is that we've kept celebrating his life rather than, you know, grieving his disappearance or death. But did you have a closure for that? I mean, it's not easy.
Is closure, I mean, I'll add to that part of what I was saying. Is closure necessary even?
Yeah, is closure necessary for that?
It's an interesting word, that. It's interesting how it's become, you know, it's actually quite a new word. So it's only in the last few years.
That's right, yeah.
Because, you know, I mean, I will share with you, like my mother lived 30 years after my brother disappeared, and she wanted a closure at her funeral. You know, so that both, you know, since he did
and so it raises the question of what is closure?
Yes, what is
and
closure?
Why is it necessary? And to what extent is it artificial? Is it something that, you know, I mean, just like we create certain realities, if you will, in order to cope better. So religion plays very much into that, right? We don't know where we came from. We don't know where we're going. So we create...
But it makes it much easier when you celebrate their life and you keep talking about their, you know...
Yeah, but on the issue of closure, I mean, I think what I would just wanted to add is, again, the artificialness of it all to make us cope with things better. Is closure one of those things? Did you ever want to get closure? Did writing the book bring you closure?
I think everyone finds their way, and maybe not one way is better than the other. So for me personally, closure has never been an interesting prospect. I'm not interested in things closing. I'm interested in things opening and expanding. I'm fascinated by the dynamism that exists between the past and the present. And as a writer, I have something to do with that. So maybe that might explain why I'm interested in it. Maybe if I were an architect, I might be thinking in a different way. I don't know. But
I'm an engineer, and I think that way.
Yes. So
the uncertain is far more interesting. The unsettled is far more interesting.
Yeah, but you know, you have to find what you can bear, right? And that's why what I said earlier about you know, feeling good about things isn't necessarily always the prize. Of course, you don't want to suffer all the time, but I think sometimes engaging with it's a bit also connected to what I was saying about the wonderment of being a human being. That part of me, I think, believes that everything that is happening and everything that I see and read and experience is there to educate me on some level, to teach me something about this incredible event, to meditate over it, you know. I do think that, I do have a kind of, I do think that meditating over nature is an important thing. There's a wonderful poet, John Clare, that I have a deep love for, and he says that all poets love nature and they are themselves love. I love that line. No, that's so. There's, I think, he's catching something about the nature of writing, or maybe the nature of art, that involved in it is an act of adoration, an act of meditating over something, thinking about it carefully, not wanting it to serve a message or something, but just, thinking about it carefully. There's a lady here that had her hand up.
Yes, this lady over here, and then Professor Shaheen,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
Professor Khadra.
Okay, thank you. أنا رجاء النايض علي
أهلا
النايض.
وسهلا.
أهلا بك. I would like to thank you, Professor Safwan, for this opportunity.
Thank you.
And I don't know, Hisham would not remember me, but the last time I saw him and his mother, he was 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
We were, as a family, Hisham's aunts from his father's side and his mother's side, we were one family. We were so bonded
Yes.
to the point when Hisham, Ziad, and their mother decided to leave, we had to let them go. That's the closure that hurts me until today, because we had to let you three go and not look for you and not contact you to save you from a bad fate. So I'm very proud to see you today, as you are, Hisham.
Thank you.
And to me, you are a dear little brother.
Thank you so much.
And
You have to tell them, though. You have to tell them how cool I was as a 7-year-old. That's very important.
but,
Those big collars and
but
the
the
fringe
second-
hair and
yeah.
the big glasses.
but the second thing I want to mention is about Hisham's mother. She was a great person.
She is.
She was a good friend to us. We are here as a family because of you, Hisham.
Thank you.
And to insist that his mother is the patriot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I agree. Thanks. Thanks. Shukran. Shukran.
I want to sit with that for a minute before we
Yes,
take the next
lovely.
question.
So lovely.
No, I want to sit with what you said. It's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. Muhammad.
Thank you, Hisham. And I would like to say that I fully agree with Professor Safwan Masri about the memorial lecture, which I personally believe, Edward Said's memorial lecture, which has been given recently. I believe that it is the best lecture I ever read, and I read them all, I attended some of them. So I would like to congratulate you on this.
Thank you so much.
And I would like to say that Hisham was kind enough to give the lecture to me as an editor-in-chief of Al-Thaqafiyya, the journal published by the University of Jordan. And we rendered it into beautiful English, and it will appear in the forthcoming issue. And there will be enough copies in a month's time here for those. But I would like to come back to the lecture. I think the way you coined the title, like a smooth landing, the guess, and that in fact you elaborated or you expanded what Tayyip Saleh said to me about the relationship between East and West, confrontation. But I mean, you put it, I think, in a more articulate way. Also, it reminds us of many, many ways of expressing this very intricate, complicated relationship between East and West, especially what Kipling said, East is East and West and West. You didn't say it bluntly, but you put it, and you gave so many intellectual dimensions to the title. Yes. One last question concerning. I mean, the way what I liked about the lecture most, I mean, the way you said that you got to know Edward through Conrad. It's not the other
Conrad
way.
introduced him.
Conrad,
Yes.
yes. To know Edward through Conrad, which is very, very original. I would like you to elaborate on this. In what way? I mean, you know what I mean.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Joseph Conrad is a writer that if you are stung by him, you are done for. I mean, he's very hard to leave, because he has a particular mode of thinking and elaborating human consciousness. He can touch the slightest sort of most quiet maneuver in somebody's mind or heart with such elegance and clarity that he becomes a kind of mentality that you want to be inside from time to time. So he provokes these kind of relationships with his text where you are rereading him from time to time. And if you have fallen victim to this, you become somewhat interested in others who suffer the same malady, right? And so Edward Said suffered from the same malady. And so I knew that he had written a book, his first book, in fact. Edward's first book was interesting. He's the only writer that I call Edward by first name. Edward. I've never met him. So I call Edward. So, but Mr. Said, his first book was on Joseph Conrad, as you know. And he really never stopped writing about him for 40 years. From time to time, he'll write about him. Or he will adopt his ghost in some way. So
like he did in Out of Place, as you were saying.
Exactly.
Earlier.
In Out of Place is a book that is aware of Joseph Conrad. So that's why it went this way for me. I was very grateful to Joseph Conrad for introducing me to Edward Said.
Yeah, in the 15 years since Edward's passing, it really was the most beautiful event and the most beautiful and eloquent lecture that was given. And I encourage everybody to either listen to it on the internet or get the lecture, which has now been published in a number of languages. And I just want to add something to that. What added to it also is that we had a musical performance.
That's right.
A year ago, I was in Ramallah at the Barnard College Music Center, and there was this clarinetist who is clarinetist, right? I mean, a guy who plays the clarinet, 14 years old, Ibrahim Sheikh. Never heard anything like that, and the passion. So we flew him in to perform as a prelude to Hisham's lecture. Edward would have been very proud of that evening.
Yes, I think. I hope.
Wafa?
Thank you, Safwan and Hisham. My friend was telling me that this is a very therapeutic session. So thank you. Therapeutic.
Oh, is it?
Therapeutic. This is what.
Well, we must start to disturb you now.
Yeah. Oh, no. So thank you, Safwan, for also giving us this space and initiating this conversation. Hisham, I love the uniqueness of the landscape of your narrative. And I felt that it has the uniqueness stirs from the fact that we are, as readers, captured in dual positions. The first one is the paternal vacuum, and the second one is the state of in-betweenness. And in a way, this kind probably of consciousness of the narrator, it created a narrator who is looking for being in particularities and in details and specificities. What do you think? Since you also touched upon this point.
Well, I think,
earlier.
I mean, the interesting thing about literature is that you cannot, it cannot function without the particular. You need a particular place, person, a time, a gesture, a word, something said, right? So it's very invested in the particular, but it's always, I feel, at its best, invested in the particular out of an enthusiasm for the general, for the universal. So I didn't want to write a book about myself, right? I wanted to use myself and my experience and my knowledge just by living in order to write about other things, you know? I mean, the paradox is that I'm actually not particularly interested in myself. You know, I oftentimes...
Which makes you all the more interesting.
I find other people far more interesting, you know. But I think that one of the ways that I think of it, there's a writer that another writer that is incredibly close to me, and a writer that I've read and reread, and oftentimes when I go out and it's a difficult time, I have a few pages of his with me. Because I think if I see something ugly, I'll just read a couple of lines, you know. He's just an incredibly powerful writer that, in my view, has written, you know, one of the most magisterial novels ever written. And it's Marcel Proust, the French writer. And Marcel Proust, the way he writes is exactly what creative writing, not good creative writing classes, because there are some very good ones, not good creative writing classes tell you not to do, right? Which is, don't use a lot of similes, and when you do use a simile or a metaphor, make sure that it arises from the life of the characters. So, for example, if your novel is about people at sea, and seamen and so on, then if you're going to use a metaphor, try to have something to do with the sea or the sky or the wind or something, you know. Well, Marcel Proust doesn't do any of these things. He's writing about otherwise not particularly interesting people, bourgeois French, you know, life. Yet the page is filled with similes and metaphors from other things. He goes into the land, he goes into the sea, he goes into natural life, into philosophy, to music. The similes are from all over the place. And one of the accumulative effects, because this is a novel that takes place over 6 books. That's why it frightens people to read it. Please don't be frightened by it. It's the most magnificent thing. But it's a long book, or it's a series of books. And the accumulative effect of it is that it's as if that Proust believes that there's a subterranean network of human emotions and psychologies that connects us all, connects everybody. And all you have to do as a writer is sort of tap into it, drill into it, and then you're somehow charged by it. It is the force that, and so I think that is also one of the roles of the particular, you know. You know, he also says, like, there's a scene towards the end of the book, at the volume that in English the title is often translated as The Captive. So it's book 6, I think. And in that book, there is a man who's dying, and he is looking at a picture. He's looking at a painting. I think the painting is by Vermeer, the Dutch painter. And he's looking at the painting, and the painting has a yellow wall in it. And Vermeer has this quality of painting a surface, painting a wall. There'll be a sitter here, and maybe a piece of furniture, and then there'll be a wall. But he has a way of painting a wall that is very moving, you know. So the character in the Marcel Proust novel is thinking, how do you do that? How do you paint a wall and have it be so moving? In other words, the question in his own thinking becomes, how do you make art? right? What is it? What is necessary? What is needed in order for you to paint something as boring as a yellow wall and have it be so moving and fascinating? And he comes up with three things. He says, kindness, scrupulosity, and self-sacrifice. Those are the three things that he comes up with. And I think that's somewhere close to what we're talking about, because kindness, I think, meant both in the sense of gentleness and human sympathy and compassion, but also meant in the Shakespearean sense, of a kind. That writing is, you're writing something that you're making a kind of something that exists. If you describe a person or a place, of course that's not the person or the place, it's a kind of them. It's an image of them, a reflection of them that has been filtered through your imagination. Scrupulosity, being scrupulous, being exact, being meticulous, that you cannot make art if you're sloppy, if you're messy, right? You need to be exact. And self-sacrifice, I think, is also part of it, because you have to somehow do away with not only, I would much rather be sitting by the Mediterranean Sea, swimming, and spending my afternoons reading Proust and having a lovely lunch. That to me that's sort of an image of what happiness would be for me, right? So it's not only self-sacrifice in the sense that you have to sit down and put in the time, but also I think self-sacrifice in the much deeper sense of your motives, your what you would like, material things, or if you write for that, or if you write for a cause, or if you write for a man, no matter how noble, right? You sell out, so you have to. So it's also self-sacrifice in that sense. Yeah.
We could go on forever, and I just noticed how many students are here.
Yeah, maybe a question
it's
from the students.
It's wonderful to have you. Maybe we can. I'd love to end with a question.
Yes,
I'm
please,
sure you would. From a student.
Yeah.
Don't force yourselves, but if.
Oh, well, why not? Force
if one
yourselves.
of you. Okay, fine. Force yourselves. But introduce yourself, please.
Mohammed Shaheen from Jubilee School.
Yeah, he's Mohammed Shaheen too.
Okay. Yeah. Of course. Now, in regards to, let's say, the political vision, as you have an outsider view, as you have been an immigrant, you didn't live in Libya, and an insider view in the same time, this contradicting mixture throughout your father. However, you have a political view about the Libyan, let's say, Arab Spring in 2011, as mentioned in the Guardian's article in August 26, 2011. And you have mentioned some opinions about some political parties like the Islamic Brotherhood, and you mentioned that they couldn't, let's say, organize democracy inside the country. However, let us say you have a vague view, from my opinion, as you have a contradicting mix through an outsider view and an insider view. So can you comment about that and how the Arab Spring in Libya, however, turned into a civil war until today between two external, let us say, intervention?
Okay, those are a lot of questions. Thank you for them. Just to clarify, I have never written that the Muslim Brotherhood are not a viable political party. I've never written that. In fact, I've often argued for, in fact, like a lot of secularists like myself, have argued for a democratic vision that would include different voices, including the Muslim Brotherhood. So that's just to clarify that. I don't know where you got that, but I've definitely never written that one. But the question about the register between my journalism and my other work, there is a real difference there for me, at least. All the stuff we've been talking about today, everything I've said about writing, is more to do with the creative side, with the novels and with the creative nonfiction I've written. It's a different register of curiosity and of complexity and of, as it were, opening up a space for contradictions. But there's another register that is more, I think of myself less of an artist in it and more like a civilian, you know, exercising his duty as a civilian, you know, for what it's worth. And in that, yes, I've written a lot of articles, particularly around the time of the revolutions. And I was totally passionate for them. And I remain totally passionate for them. It is, to me, completely understandable why looking at the present, looking at how fractured and brutal and dysfunctional the present is, why someone would start regretting the events of the revolution. But to that person, I would like to encourage a different way of thinking. I believe that the most exciting thing about time is that in every moment is contained resonances of everything that has happened before. That's why literature is interested in time, because literature is interested in bringing to the surface the resonances of the past. And in the present moment in Libya, you have in it everything that has happened, right? In other words, I believe that the present reality of Libya is more loyal to historical events, right, not least of all the Gaddafi reality over 42 years, than it is to the principles and aims of the revolution. Those two things are, I think that's a very important thing to say. The other thing that I think is important in this moment of bewilderment, of seeing not one or two, but several countries in our region being torn apart by consequences of brave men and women standing up and calling for dignity and human rights and the rule of law and democracy. It's very important to remember at moments like this that those early calls, and to be specific with Libya, were one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed in my life. You have, in Libya, you had a reality that was comprehensive. You had a dictatorship that was comprehensive. It had time to impose its vision, to alter the minds, and you had limitless appetite on the behalf of the dictatorship to exact brutality. Yet under all of these circumstances, people, men and women, went out onto the streets and called for a different way to live, a different interpretation of what it means to be a human being, what a society is, what are the responsibilities between the society and the government. That is a truly glorious event that we cannot let the brutality of the present alter that moment. The other reason why I'm unenthusiastic about the conclusion of regret, of sort of lashing, one's back, oh, it was terrible what we did. And I know people who have fought in the revolution. I know former political prisoners in Libya who now say, oh, we were wrong, we wish back for the days of Gaddafi. And I understand that. I don't say this to ridicule, not for a minute. I understand and I respect that position. But my disagreement with that position is almost structural. The present is the child of that reality. Wanting that reality to persist is deepening the problem, not solving it. And
it's so important.
Yeah, and so and it also, I think, on some level, it's psychologically here I'm speaking, not politically or historically. There is something in that statement of we don't deserve democracy, we wish Gaddafi to be back. There's something in that statement that is self-loathing, and what we have been through, our country, what we have been through, makes us susceptible to self-loathing, and that's really a very. So on some level, I disagree with the position, and I feel a great sense of tenderness towards it and sympathy towards it, because it's also a position that arises from a trauma,
Right. It's so powerful. We could go on forever, as I said, and I feel so incredibly happy to have been able to share a little bit of
Thank you, Safwan.
with my friends in Amman. On behalf of everybody here, Hisham, thank you for being so generous of your mind and of your soul. And
Thank you. Thanks.
it's not only that you, and I know how busy you are, that you made the time and you came to Amman, but that you share so openly of yourself. And we are incredibly fortunate to be the recipients of what you have to give.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Habib. Thank you. Thanks.
Habib.
Thank you. Thanks so much.